let's get started. The traditional blessing is Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kichanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
We thank God for inviting us to participate in occupying ourselves with Torah, not only reading and studying it, but adding Torah into our lives. What are the lessons that we can learn? So the procedure, again, I'll remind you what we had envisioned for this is that we'll take some time to review the last three parshiot, the last three portions since we met the last time, that will then put us into the right frame of reference for this week's portion, or as they say on the television things, previously in our Torah. I'm going to summarize Vayigash, which is chapters 44 to 47 of Genesis. We're going back there, and then Gary and then David will help us finish the book of Genesis and begin the book of Exodus, and then I'll come back for the second portion in Exodus in Shemot. Okay, so where we were is, if you're in the Joseph cycle or the Joseph narrative, is that the brothers had, because of famine in the land all over that part of the world, they had come to Egypt to seek food and provisions. They did not know that the man before whom they were standing was indeed Joseph, their brothers. And Joseph wants to test their loyalty, their maturity, their sensitivity. So he arranges for a goblet to be placed in the sack of Benjamin, the youngest, as all the brothers prepare to go back with some food to back to their father. And then he sends the army after them. They're brought back and they're accused of the crime of theft, and sends them back, but is going to keep Benjamin as ransom. Judah steps forward as he's stepping into the role as leader of the clan. Judah steps forward, reminding Joseph that they had already told Joseph about their elderly father. Joseph had not commented about that necessarily. Judah pleads with Joseph, let me stay as your captive, as your, if you will, let Benjamin go back so that Dad doesn't have to suffer again the loss of a favorite son. Joseph accepts their sincerity and explains to them. Well, first of all, he tells all the Egyptians to leave their presence. So he's alone with the brothers, and he reveals himself. Ani Yosef Achichem, I am Joseph, your brother. Ha'od Avichai, is my father still alive? Well, I'm going to have some more comments about that particular encounter in a few moments. It rings with great resonance for our community. The brothers are at first afraid that Joseph is going to punish them, given his authority and his power. But Joseph basically says to them, "No, don't worry, don't be afraid. That all this was part of God's plan. God sent me ahead of you here to Egypt for good purposes. So go and bring this good news to our father, and then have him come back, have him and the whole clan come back here, and I will provide for you." Pharaoh is very pleased when he hears all of this story, and he offers full assistance of the government, if you will. Notice that this Pharaoh who partners with Joseph. This Pharaoh welcomes the Israelites, welcomes the immigrants, doesn't fear them at all, as opposed to 430 years later, the new Pharaoh who takes an entirely different approach. Um, uh, um, on the journey to Egypt, coming from Beersheba, then Jacob has one more vision that God appears to him and promises to be with him there, even in Egypt. And he will become Israel will become a great nation. Joseph and Jacob reconnect in Goshen, and Jacob looks at Joseph and says, "Now I can die in peace." It's almost like those of you who know the show Les Mis. It's almost like what's his name? Why am I blanking on his name? Jean Valjean, looking and saying, now I can finally die in peace, having everyone brought back together again, and the whole story and are willing to accept it. Joseph and Jacob are now together. There's question about how the Israelites will maintain themselves when they're in Goshen. The Egyptians looked down upon shepherds, but again, Joseph and Pharaoh convince them that this would be the best livelihood for the Israelites. Joseph tells Pharaoh and everyone that this has been our family's history. This is our tradition to take care of the livestock. And so Pharaoh, as a gesture and an acknowledgement of how important they will be to the Egyptian community, Pharaoh puts Joseph and Jacob and all the brothers and the tribes in charge of all the flocks in Goshen. The Israelites increase in numbers and in wealth. Joseph, as a great proponent of economic theory, barters food from the storehouses to get more livestock for his own family to be able to take care of them. And then when there's no more livestock, he barters more food from people for additional land to be able to give to the Israelites. And Joseph devises a taxation plan of 4/5 and 1/5, that the landowners can maintain 4/5 of their property, but 1/5 will go to Pharaoh or the government, if you will, as taxation, and thus they are able to ride out the famine in that sense. So I want to just focus for a moment on two particular questions, or actually just one particular question that the rabbis focus on. Why did Joseph, before he revealed himself to his brothers, why did he tell all the Egyptians to leave the room so that they were alone? Was that a smart move or was that a foolish move? And the rabbis in the commentaries and debate back and forth. Why did he do that? Was it smart? Was it foolish? And some of them, Rabbi Chama ben Chanina says it was a serious mistake on Joseph's part. He really didn't know about his brothers. They could have attacked him. They could have killed him. And whatever, who really didn't know. But most of the rabbis, most of the commentators praise Joseph for taking the risk of revealing himself and being sensitive to their feelings as well. Also to this moment that might be perceived by the Egyptians as a moment of weakness. That Rabbi Samuel in the Talmud talks of Joseph being extremely sensitive and wise. He recognized that through their words that the brothers already felt guilty and they regretted what they had done in selling him into slavery. And he was very concerned, especially for the fate of Benjamin and what that would mean to Joseph. The modern teacher and scholar and commentator Nechama Leibovich, whom I'll be talking about also later this morning, basically gives the quote. She said, "Joseph smoothed the way for reconciliation by offering the explanation that it wasn't their fault. And he had certainly had no right to exact punishment on them. This was all part of God's plan, and God intended it for good. Because after all, how would the story be able to proceed with the slavery in Egypt and then the liberation from Egypt and what that meant for the development of Israel, the Israelites as a people? So that was the portion known as Vayigash. It's the second last portion in the book of Bereshit, and I'm going to hand it over to Gary to finish up that book, tell the rest of the story, as it were, because we might think that everybody would live happily ever after, but that's not quite the way that it goes. Gary?
I think if I'm pronouncing it, it's Vayashi, the portion.
Vayachi. So get your chachar working. Vayachi.
Vayachi. And it actually starts at the very end of chapter 47. It talks about how Israel dwelled then in the land of Egypt and within the land of Egypt and the land of Goshen, and they had holdings and how they were fruitful and multiplied greatly. And then it talks to Jacob, and it intersperses Jacob's name with Israel throughout this portion again. And he lived in Egypt for total of 17 years. He was 147 years old when he gets with, calls his son in and gets a commitment from him, promise to that he will carry his body to his father and the family's burial site, the cave that goes back to when Abraham purchased that property in some manner, and not that he not be buried in Egypt. And of course Joseph commits to that. As you get into chapter 48, it has Joseph taking his sons Manasseh and Ephraim to visit Jacob, and Jacob blesses them. But once again, even though Joseph brings the boys to the right side, his father crosses his arms and blesses the youngest one with his right hand and the older one with the left hand. Joseph objects in a manner and is told by Jacob that no, the younger son will become the greater, and his seed shall be fullness of nations. And then Jacob intends to give Joseph's family, it lets Joseph know he intends to give his family more than his brothers. In chapter 49, Jacob calls all of the sons together with him so he can tell them what shall befall them in the days to come, kind of forecasts the future for them. And this kind of leads into one of the earliest, if not the earliest, for a form of poem. And according to Robert Alter, that the lead-in is kind of the giveaway to the poem, because it's a common lead-in back in those days. It said, "Assemble and hearken, O Jacob's sons," and then you get this really lengthy. I wasn't quite sure that it was really poetic, but it's kind of bits and pieces, and it is considered to be a poem. It's a poetic decree. It's quite harsh on many of Joseph's brothers, but most gentle towards Judah and Joseph. And it's basically him describing what their future will be and basically establishing the 12 tribes. And that's the main part of chapter 49. Chapter 50 talks about Joseph, and we see how emotional and, as Rabbi said, sensitive a person he was. It describes how he falls on his father and hugs him and cries, and similar to how he deals with his brothers and the occasions when he presents himself to them originally, and then later in this chapter when they again come back to him after the father has been moved to the burial site out of Egypt. The sons then feel, Jacob's other sons feel like this may be the opportunity when Joseph is going to punish them for the way they treated him. But no, that's, he makes it clear to them that's not the case. And again, it's just shows how emotional and sensitive of a person that he is. Describes in some detail, and then how Joseph goes actually, I think in a written form, from what I understand from Alter, he actually via a messenger goes to the Pharaoh. There's some discussion about why he didn't do it in person or why he even needed to ask, but he asked permission to take his father, and permission to take all the adults and quite a large caravan out. He did leave the younger members of the family back in Goshen to take care of the herds, and some say that's because that was to be a reassurance to the Pharaoh that they were coming back. They weren't it wasn't a ploy just to leave Egypt. Although I think with the relationship that I've read here, the relationship that Joseph has with that Pharaoh, I don't think that probably was maybe as big an issue as some people make it to be. But anyway, so it describes in some more detail, though, in chapter 50, really about taking his father to the burial site, and then how that came about, and then talks to the fact that Joseph remains in Egypt, dies at the age of 110 years of age. They're all starting to die a little younger, it seems, in every portion that they go through. And he does ask his brothers to take his bones. And that was kind of a couple of things that were different about both the burials of Jacob, is that he, take it Joseph, it must have been at his insistence, had the father buried in a casket, which wasn't really the normal way they were doing things back then. I think they probably, from what I understand, they just wrapped them up and put them in a hole. But he kind of imposed some of the Egyptian burial rites on his father, and in terms of the wait time and everything. And I don't know that we had any formal, that they had, the Israelites at that time had any formal wait times established in the laws. But it was like 40 days, and then it was a 70-day period before they took him out of the country, and before, after they embalmed him. And of course, Joseph was going to be embalmed and honored too. That was a little more understandable because he was part of the Egyptian, leadership. But he still made his brothers promise that when the day came that they, or the kids, were able to leave Egypt, that they would take his bones and take him back to the family burial site outside of Egypt. And that was basically it.
Okay, let me just jump in for a minute.
Sure.
The tradition is when we finish one book of the Torah, before beginning another, there's a phrase that we recite: Chazak, Chazak, Venit Chazek. Let us be strong, and strengthen each other. We mark the end of one book, the last phrase of the book of Genesis is that they were encamped in Egypt. And then now we begin the book of Exodus. Professor David, if you will, please.
Thank you. And
thanks, Gary.
And thank you, Gary. Enjoyed that. This preparing for this morning reminded me of the happy times I had as a graduate student at Queen's in Ontario, Canada, when I had to prepare seminars, and I haven't had to do that since then. So this was really a very exciting thing for me.
That was the hope. So maybe others will want to, want to do it also and have the same kind of smile that you just demonstrated to us.
Oh, I hope so.
Okay. All right.
But it brings a couple of questions before we even begin. And one of them is, why do we study Torah at all? And besides the fact, first, it is our obligation to study Jewish history, myth, and legend. But B, perhaps even more fundamental to that, is that Jewish history relates directly to our postmodern age. And I believe it is important when we study Torah to find connections to more recent history. Shemot is the first portion of Exodus. It is the book that deals with Israel's slavery in Egypt and their subsequent departure. It is one of the most important, famous, and fundamental documents in the Torah. Its contents are celebrated in two of Judaism's most important celebrations: Pesach, the celebration of freedom, and Shavuot, or first fruits or weeks, the celebration of Moses' receiving the Ten Commandments. The portion has been celebrated throughout history in books, plays, and films. And the portion of today forms the beginning of Cecil B. DeMille's The Ten Commandments. In fact, much of the opening of this portion has been accurately portrayed, if not somewhat exaggerated, in that film. There are records from Greek and Latin that recount stories from Egypt of the expulsion of a group of foreigners during the Ptolemaic period. These ancient Egyptian rulers were Macedonian Greek royal family, which ruled the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt during the Hellenistic period. And their rule lasted for almost 300 years, from 305 to 30 BCE. They were the last dynasty of ancient Egypt, and there were records of several Ptolemies who ruled Egypt. However, Claudius Ptolemy, the famous astrologer who wrote the Almagest and set the course of astrology and astronomy for thousands of years, was not likely related to them. I think the purpose of this portion is to emphasize just how vital the concept of freedom under the law is to Jerusalem. Archaeologists have found some small relics from the Sinai where the Hebrews were said to have traveled, but there is generally no historical evidence to back up the story. I really wish that there were. And it would be so nice if somewhere under Jerusalem, someday the Ark of the Covenant could be located. But even if Exodus is only a mytho-historical account, I think that its major purpose is to teach us what Judaism is all about. It begins with the names of the sons of Israel going to Egypt: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, etc. Joseph, their father, was already in Egypt. I suppose he got there with an earlier flight. And we now move forward with verse 8 of chapter 1, in which a new king is appointed to rule over Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers and all that generation. The people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. But there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, "Behold, the people of Israel are too many, and come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies, they fight against us, and they escape from the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh the cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. The Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they made the people of Israel work as slaves, and they made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. And when we study just this part about people in slavery, it brings us back to our own history in the United States. For example, January the 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln signed Proclamation 95, the Emancipation Proclamation. And the president changed the legal status under federal law of more than 3.5 million enslaved African Americans in the secessionist Confederate States from enslaved to free. Ultimately, the Union victory brought that proclamation into effect of all of the former Confederacy. And it was never challenged in court. And Lincoln also insisted about reconstruction plans for the southern state and pushed for passage of the 13th Amendment. Congress passed that vote on January 31st, 1865. And that, of course, leads us to Black Lives Matter in our own time. We can expand that, I think, to All Lives Matter. Jews around the world observe Passover every year. It comes in a few months from now, and it is a celebration of freedom for all peoples. I think that after Yom Kippur, it may be the most important Jewish observers. And we go on that a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him. But as the child grew, she could hide him no longer, and she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it, placed it among the reeds by the river bank. And his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. The daughter of Pharaoh, and you all remember this from the movie, if not from Exodus. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river while her young women walked beside the river. She saw the basket. When she opened it, she saw the child. The baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." And she said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew woman to nurse the child from you?" And the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses because she said, "I drew him out of the water." And now, meantime, Pharaoh is really getting tough on Israel. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, "When you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live." The midwives feared God, and they did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the male children live. The king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this?" The midwives said, "Because the Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous, and they give birth before the midwife comes to them." So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied, and they continued to go strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. And Pharaoh commanded all his people, "Every son that is born to the Hebrews, you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live." And in chapter 2, Moses is fleeing to Midian, and it begins when he found the Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, 2 Hebrews were struggling together. And he said to the man in the wrong, "Why did you strike your companion?" The man answered, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid, and he thought, "Surely this thing is going to be known." The Pharaoh heard of it. He sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian. And we continue with with Moses' early life, that God hears Israel's groaning. And during the many days that king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery, and they cried out for help. Their cry for rescue came up to God. God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. In chapter 3, the portion discusses the burning bush. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire in the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, The bush was burning, and yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. And God answered, Do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I'm the God of your father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of this land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the place of the Canaanites. And now behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. I will send you to Pharaoh, so you may bring my people out of Egypt. And Moses answered, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children out of Egypt? And God said, But I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this very mountain. And Moses asked, If I come to the people of Israel and say that to them, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. You'll say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. The Lord, the God of your fathers, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. And Moses replied, But behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say, The Lord did not appear to you. And then the Lord did something quite interesting. He said, What's that in your hand? He said, A staff. And God said, Throw it on the ground. So Moses threw it on the ground, and it became a serpent, a snake. And Moses ran from it, just as we would all do that now, pretty much. But the Lord said to Moses, Put out your hand and catch it by the tail. And he did that, and suddenly it became a staff again, that they may believe that the Lord, the God of Abraham, will do as he promised. Our portion concludes with the first verse of chapter 6, just one verse. And the Lord said unto Moses, Now shalt thou see what I will do to Pharaoh, for by a strong hand shall he let them go, and by a strong hand shall he drive them out of this land. I think, in conclusion, that this portion gives us an important lesson that relates to the horrifying events that we have all experienced in the last few days. The freedom that God helped give to Israel was virtually lost at Sinai, and this goes way ahead of the portion, but it relates. When many of the crowd there below, at the foot of the mountain, refused to obey the law that Moses was bringing to them, they rebelled, and Moses came down absolutely with a huge temper, and he threw the tablets there, and most of the people died. And I think we have that learning to do right now, that without the freedom is not freedom without the law. It is freedom under the law. In our country right now, it is equal justice under law, and therefore the portion we are studying today, at least one of the portions we are studying today, is directly relating to the events of the past week. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Gary. Yashar kochachem. I want to add just a few little comments, brief comments about where we were, and then if there are questions or things that people want to comment also before we continue. David alluded to the fact of how important, and we all know this, how important the exodus from Egypt has become and has been maintained in Jewish tradition and Jewish thinking. As a matter of fact, I just would remind you that the Jewish tradition really talks in terms of three ultimate events as the cornerstones or the foundation points for the Jewish people. One is creation of the world. The other is the Exodus from Egypt. And then the third is the revelation at Mount Sinai. But it's the first two. It's creation of the world and the liberation or the Exodus from Egypt that we include every time that we say the Kiddush, every time we celebrate Shabbat. Those are the two reasons. We say Zecher L'Maaseh Bereshit, Zecher L'Tziat Mitzrayim. It's a reminder of the creation of the world. It's a reminder of the Exodus from Egypt, that we are who we are. First, that we are who we are as human beings, and secondly, that we are who we are as a free people. So I wanted to point that out. And then the other thing is just ask people for your imaginations, perhaps, to go crazy a little bit. You may have noticed, as it was pointed out, that contrary to Cecil B. DeMille's account in the movie, we don't know anything about Moses growing up. From the day that he's adopted by Pharaoh's daughter, the rabbis give her the name of Bitya, a daughter of God rather than a daughter of Pharaoh. But her name is not given necessarily in the Torah. But from the moment that she adopts him, and Miriam comes along and says, "May I can provide you with a nursemaid," being Yocheved, his actual mother, until the day that he goes out and sees a taskmaster attacking an Israelite slave. We don't know anything about, did he eat Wonder Bread? Did he eat pita? We don't really know anything about growing up, what he was told about being an Israelite, what he was told about being an Egyptian, the whole thing in the movie about him and Yul Brynner being opponents for Nefertiti's affection. That none of that is in the Torah whatsoever. So we kind of let our imaginations go. The Midrash is certainly filled with it, and I would invite you to just kind of speculate on your own as well of what was his upbringing and where did he get the value system that would allow him to intercede on behalf of a slave who was being physically attacked by one of the taskmasters. I'll pause for a minute. If anybody has any questions about either the last two portions in Genesis or the first portion that we were talking about, Shemot or Exodus, Shemot in Hebrew or Exodus in English, before we go on. Yes, David, hands up. Yes, sir.
Yeah, just a little comment that the last time I was visiting Washington, I got a little bit of American history by reading the quotations on the walls of the government buildings. The Supreme Court, equal justice under law. The National Archive was especially moving to me. It said, "What is past is prologue." And I think that relates so closely to what we're studying today.
Yes. Anyone else with a question or a comment? Otherwise, we'll consider all that prologue and we'll go on. Oh, and welcome. Morning, Grace. We started before you got in, so we didn't get to say good morning. Thanks for being here. Okay, so the next portion, Va'era, literally means I appeared. God is speaking. I appeared. God tells Moses, "I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, your father, your grandfather, your great grandfather, and now I am appearing to you, and your role will be to free the Israelites and bring them in return to the land that I had promised to your ancestors. Moses continues to reject and defer this call. Say, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? And he said, Pharaoh won't listen to me. Who am I? I'm only a mere shepherd at this point. I can't speak to him. A little bit later on, he'll use the phrase that he's slow of speech. I'll come back to that in a moment. So God understands and says, okay, you go as my representative. And now that I have shown you, as was mentioned, about turning your staff into a serpent, into a snake, you know what I am capable of. So you go as my representative. You'll handle the audio visual, and Aaron, your older brother, will be the spokesman. Interestingly enough, the word that is used to describe here Aaron as the spokesman is the Hebrew word navi. Navi, which later on will be translated as prophet, but prophet in the sense of specifically bringing God's word. It comes from the Hebrew root that means to come or to come forward or to enter. But here it's a spokesman rather than one who predicts the future or one who is going to be a soothsayer, if you will. So Moses accepts this call, and with Aaron, and goes in. He finds Aaron, finds Miriam. He returns to Egypt and speaks to the Israelites, the Bnei Yisrael, and using some of the verbiage that we had learned when Moses himself asks God, how shall I describe you? The people don't know you. They haven't had any encounter with you for over 400 years. So God says that I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, as God Almighty. But now I will appear in using the different name that comes out of this Ehyeh, Asher Ehyeh. I am that which I am. I will be that which I will be. And when you put that in Hebrew into the third person singular form rather than Ehyeh, Asher Ehyeh, that's the first person, that God's speaking. When someone else is speaking about God, it becomes into the third person, and that becomes that four-letter root of Yud He Vav He, that God will be, God will exist, God does exist. Some people try to pronounce that or include that in their translations as Jehovah or as Yahweh or Yahweh, but we really do not know. That's a whole other discussion. We don't know exactly what the pronunciation was, and the tradition long ago said, lest we make a mistake and use God's name accidentally, unintentionally, in vain. So we're just going to use the euphemism of Adonai whenever we see that four-letter appearance, if you will. The famous paragraph that, if you see it in the Torah, you say, okay, now why am I associating that so importantly, so significantly? It's the paragraph that will be recounted also in the Haggadah on Passover, on Pesach, and we learn it over and over and over again by having 4 cups of wine, and each cup represents one of the verbs in God's promise through Moses to the people at this point. I will free you from Egypt. I will deliver you from Egypt. I will take you to be my people, and I will bring you unto the land. And that's 4. So each of the cups of wine at the Passover Seder refers to one of those 4 verbs. But here's the problem. There are 4 verbs in that one paragraph, But if you look at the next sentence in the next paragraph, God says, I will redeem you. And so the question is, should there be 4 or 5 cups of wine to remind us of God's promises, the various facets of God's promise? The rabbis argue, should there be 4 or 5? And they reach a compromise. Coming back onto the lesson that we could all learn in these days, that you reach a compromise rather than just ending in battle, even if it's only verbal battle. And the compromise is that we will drink 4 cups, but we will have the 5th cup poured. And when Elijah comes, because Elijah visits every Seder on Passover, Elijah will give us the true answer of whether we should. Elijah is the ultimate Navi, the ultimate prophet. He can speak for God as to whether or not we should be drinking that 5th cup. That's why it's called the cup of Elijah, or Elijah's cup. And now we will know. So if Elijah says, yes, we're supposed to include that 5th verb, I will redeem you, we've got our cup already there, and we can go ahead and drink it. So that's the Talmudic story of whether it's 4 or 5 cups of wine. It's based on the paragraph and 1 extra sentence in this particular chapter. But the people, the Israelites, the slaves, have been, according to the text, have been crushed by their slavery. And so Moses looks to God and says, what am I supposed to do now? How can I go speak to Pharaoh if the people themselves won't even listen and won't even accept? And God says again that Aaron will tell the truth. You're just going to be, like I say, you're going to be the audiovisual specialist. And Aaron will speak the words, trust me, the people will come to believe, and indeed Pharaoh will, and all the Egyptians will come to believe. God warns Moses that Pharaoh won't be easy to convince, but ultimately everything will be okay. God says, I place you in the role of God to Pharaoh, and Aaron will be your Navi. Everything will be all right. Then you get into another question, and we'll deal with this a little bit more in further depth. God says, I will harden Pharaoh's heart and bring punishments upon Egypt. So the Egyptians will know that I am Adonai. So one of the questions is, does God want all the Egyptians to come to know God first and then convince the Pharaoh that he has been wrong all along? Is that the role of the people? Again, some of these are open-ended questions. We now enter the direct confrontations that are reminded again in the Haggadah with all the plagues. 7 of them appear in this Torah portion. Moses and Aaron appear to Pharaoh. Aaron turns Moses' staff into a servant, and then the Egyptian magicians do the same. But Aaron's servant, and again, you can picture the 10 Commandments, the Cecil B. DeMille movie of seeing this. The Aaron's staff swallows up the Egyptian magicians, snakes. If Pharaoh hardens his heart and rejects the pleas of Moses and Aaron. A second time they appear as Pharaoh is finishing his morning swim. Some of the commentators say it's at the same place where the daughter had found Moses in the reeds. But he's finishing his morning swim, and Moses and Aaron come and turn all the water of the Nile into blood. But the Egyptian magicians do the same, and Pharaoh hardens his heart again. 7 days later, God tells Moses to threaten Pharaoh with a plague of frogs. The magicians do that also, but Pharaoh tells Moses that if God will remove the frogs, then he will let the people go to worship God. Now, and what Moses does remove the frogs, but Pharaoh again hardens his heart and refuses to let the people go. So sidebar for a moment, for a moment. There's confusion, and I'm willing to say it this way. There's confusion on Pharaoh's part, sometimes on Moses's part, sometimes on our part. We all know the phrase, sometimes we say it, sometimes we sing it, let my people go. Right? We all know that phrase. Okay? Shlach et ami in Hebrew, let my people go. Some of you have heard me say on various occasions, it's all a matter of the dots. It's all a matter of the little punctuation points. Okay? So shalach, which literally is send forth, okay, doesn't necessarily mean free the people, okay? It doesn't necessarily mean liberate the people. Depending on how you put the punctuation in, it could also just simply mean send them out, lead them out, okay? If I'm sending a letter in the mail, it's the same verb. Okay? If I am sending an emissary or a messenger, a representative, it's the same verb. It's not necessarily liberate. It's not necessarily free the people. And so there are times when we don't really know, is Pharaoh understanding the verb as let my people go out into the wilderness, several days' journey, so they may worship God, and then they'll return. Pharaoh's saying to himself, and Moses may be saying to Pharaoh as an explanation, listen, these people, these Israelites, these slaves have not had an encounter with this God who's now coming before them for over 400 years. They need education, they need examples, they need experience in how to worship God. That's all we're asking. Let's take them out. Let us take them out to the mountain of God, okay, where Moses had seen the burning bush, whatever. No, sometimes known as Sinai, sometimes known as Horeb. Let's take them out there, show them what it is, let them learn about God, and then they'll come back. I'm not necessarily asking that you liberate the people. And there are those who see that's part of the first segment of the story, if you will, maybe through plagues 5, 6, and 7, until ultimately there's a change, a significant change into no, let my people go, free my people. We've had enough of this already. Your time is up. Again, make your own connection to present day politics, if you will. So at this point, we're not sure whether what Moses is demanding or what Pharaoh is hearing. We get to the, God tells Moses and Aaron again, go to Pharaoh, or else we're going to bring lice to all the people. The magicians cannot duplicate that one, saying that this must be the power of their God. Pharaoh, however, still doesn't accept it, says no. There are ongoing confrontations, more plagues, insects, death of livestock, boils, hailstorms. Pharaoh always gives in at first, or implies that he's going to give in, and then his heart hardens. At one point, it changes from Pharaoh hardens his heart unto God hardens Pharaoh's heart. That may be a discussion for another opportunity. Moses's final warning is Shalach et ami v'ya'avduni, let my people go so that they may worship. And Pharaoh says, still no, even though he's threatened with personal plagues. And that's where this particular portion, where the portion known as Va'era ends. Next week, the portion of Bo will conclude with the final 3 plagues, and then ultimately into the preparation for the Exodus. So for a few minutes, then I want to go back to this question of hardening of the heart. Was Pharaoh freely making his own decision, or was God kind of playing with him? Remember, the context, at least as Joseph had understood it and said to his brothers, was this is all part of God's master plan. God is the puppeteer, and we are just puppets. We are just actors in a play, doing whether it's us, the Israelites, whether it's the Pharaoh, whether it's the Midianites, everyone has their part to play in God's script. So the rabbis, the commentators, asked the question of, can we really blame Pharaoh if indeed he didn't have any free will in this matter, if he's just doing what God is making him do? Was God playing with him, or is that an incorrect way of telling the story and relating to the story? The Torah mentions that phrase in one way or the other about Pharaoh's heart being hardened, whether he did it himself, whether that God hardens it. The phrase is actually mentioned 20 times. The first 10 times relate to the first 5 plagues, and each of those times Pharaoh hardens his own heart. But the second 10 times relate to the last 5 plagues, and in those it's God hardened Pharaoh's heart. There's definitely a distinction that is there in the text. One of the classic rabbis, Reish Lakish, says that God gave Pharaoh every opportunity to change his mind and to allow the Israelites to leave. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean leave permanently, but to leave for a while or to be freed. We're not sure which way Moses and Pharaoh interpreted it. The plagues were warnings to Pharaoh, and believe it or not, this is already an illustration from almost 2,000 years ago. And most of us have probably been in this situation. Like parents saying to a reticent child, I'm going to count to 5. Okay. And if you don't obey me, by the time I reach 5, you're going to have to suffer the consequences. And that's the context in which Reish Lakish places this. Okay. No, I've given you 5 chances. No, you haven't accepted my word. Now you're really going to have to pay. Now we're really going to get serious. In other words, Pharaoh brought on the consequences on his own or through his own stubbornness, if you will. So I thought that was always a very cute way of looking at it and trying to explain it. I referred earlier to Nechama Leibovich, with whom I studied, as did most American or students from all over the world. If you did a year of study, a junior year abroad, or first year graduate school or rabbinic school, whatever it might be, it was a required class to take at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem with Nechama Leibovich. And in her commentary, she has 6 or 7 different chapters about this portion, but the one that I found the most meaningful, the most immediate, if you will, was she asks, what's the real purpose of the plagues? And she says we need to look at the plagues as not so much as punishment to the Egyptians or even punishment to Pharaoh, so much as the purpose is to know the Lord, to know Adonai. Okay, we're doing this so that they will know the Lord, as opposed to considering the Pharaoh himself as the ultimate king, Lord, ruler, God, if you will. There are 10 different times in this particular portion. There are 10 different times that phrase is used, just as there were 10 plagues, just as there were 10 times, as I just mentioned, of 10 times of uh, um, the hardening of the heart. One of the classic commentators is Don Isaac Abravanel. I mentioned him last time also, and Nechama Leibovich includes a lot of his stuff too. Abravanel lives at the same time as the Spanish Inquisition. And matter of fact, he is an advisor to Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand. He tries to convince them not to evict all of the Jews from the Iberian Peninsula. But Abravanel divides the plagues, the 9 first plagues, and I know we're going a little bit into next week's portion, but he divides the 9 first plagues. The 10th, being the death of the firstborn, is an entirely different one. But he divides the first 9 into 3 different sets of plagues, each of which was intended to, in its phrasing, not necessarily in its implementation, but in the phrasing given to Moses and Aaron of what to say to Pharaoh and the Egyptians, each of which is to relate to a particular way of coming to know the Lord, coming to know Adonai as God rather than the Pharaoh. And Abravanel says, so the first 3 plagues are to prove that God exists, that this one God exists. Secondly, is to assert that God is providential, that God cares, that God is aware of the welfare of the people's livestock, as well as the Egyptians themselves. And then the third is to demonstrate that God has the power to change the natural order of things, if at God's own will, should he choose to. So she makes an example of using hail, which is the last plague in this particular portion. It's the 7th out of the 10. That God gives a warning for the livestock and for for men and beast, that God tells them to protect themselves. This is warning. It's not just you're going to wake up. It's not just a sudden occurrence of the hail. And then Pharaoh, as a result of that, Pharaoh acknowledges and actually says, Adonai Hatzadik, Va'ani ve'ami harasha'im. Pharaoh actually acknowledges after plague number 7, which is the one that finishes this particular portion. Pharaoh acknowledges, God, Adonai, is righteous because he's issued the warnings both to human beings and to livestock, and wants to show his providential care as well, and that I and my people are the ones who are evil in not paying attention. But then, of course, he will reverse himself. His heart will be hardened again. The plagues are not just to let the people go, in other words, but to teach the Egyptians, and by extension then to teach the entire civilized world about our God, about the Israelite God, the one whom we call Adonai. So that's what I wanted to share with you about this particular portion. We have a few minutes left. Who has questions, comments, insights, stories? Might be from a Passover, might be from a Seder, might be from reading the Torah, whatever. I can go on. I have a couple other notes here, but I did want to make sure that we had some minutes for conversation if there were. So make sure if you've got a question, make sure that to unmute yourself and join in. Gentlemen, we did a great job. Gary, we did a great job this way. No questions, no comments. Everybody understands completely.
Well, Rabbi, I might add, why do you think, or why do they say, why did they go into this poem? That I just, that's in my portion, versus just continuing.
Oh, the kind of it's not a blessing. It's like Jacob's deathbed poem. Poem. Yeah, I question the word poem, because when we think of poetry, we might think of having a certain rhythm to it. Certainly having a certain in our day, there's frequently rhyming. There's a meter that it follows. Biblical literature is somewhat different. When they talk of a poem, and it's the same word for poem or song, incidentally, it's a shirah in Hebrew. But it's usually done, and I haven't opened my text to look specifically, although a lot of it I remember. It's usually done with a sense, it's marked by what they call parallelism, that there will be two lines that are very, very similar. They're very, very parallel. They might even say the same kind of thing, but using synonyms or euphemisms. And there might be a certain rhythm and meter to it. There, certainly in the, if you go to an Orthodox synagogue or a traditional synagogue and you hear someone chanting those particular verses, it's a little bit, they go into more of a, I guess what we would call a sing-song kind of pattern, rather than the more typical trope that we use. Like, think of the way that we chant the Via Hafta, da 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 da. So that's our typical trope, and it changes a little bit to allow for the what's the correct word? I'll make up a word. The syllabization.
Syllabic.
Yeah. So the syllabic tone. Now, having said all that, Gary, I don't know about Alter, because you said you were using Alter's translation or commentary, but some of the classical biblical criticism would say that entire, and in rabbinic literature, it's called Jacob's blessing, not poem or song. Okay, but as he's blessed, his deathbed blessing to all the sons, we usually think of a blessing as being entirely positive, but there are certainly those, as you mentioned, that are more negative in tone, of Jacob's disappointment, and he's predicting that if such and such is the case, if this has been the kind of behavior that the leader of your tribe has demonstrated, then I'm praying that those who follow after won't continue that kind of pattern. But biblical criticism from the 18th and 19th century, mostly 19th century, would say that this is probably something that was added much later on into the text. And if that was the case, of course, it's going to sound and it's like the difference of modern English today and Chaucer or Shakespeare. Okay, the pattern of the language and the typical pattern of what a sentence sounds like, or a verse in a poem or a song, is totally different. And indeed, the biblical scholars, many of whom would say that this particular section was added 350 years later into the text that they had at the time.
Yeah.
So that might explain why it seems totally different.
He says in his he gives a lot of explanation under everything. He said there is a debate among scholars as to whether the poem is a single composition, or like you said, or rather a kind of centro of poetic fragments about the fate of the various tribes that were in circulation in the early phase of Israelite history.
It certainly is what we would say today. It's revisionist history. The author had to know certain things of what happens to those tribes.
Yeah.
Later on.
Yeah, he said it generally agreed, however, that this is one of the oldest extended texts in the Bible.
Mm-hmm. Right. Right, and it's separated out, and it's written in a little bit of a different form in the Torah text, so it's identifiable. Right. Jean, please.
The fact that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, you had mentioned a little bit about free will, and that this was an example not of free will, but how God hardened Pharaoh's heart, and that Pharaoh had nothing to do with it in a way.
Supposedly they make a distinction between the first 5 versus the second 5. The first 5, it's his choice. The second 5 is God hardens his heart.
What do the contemporary Torah scholars have to say about free will, knowing that this is the case? Are there real differences between, say, conservative and reform scholars on this?
Well, there's always going to be a difference between scholars, no matter what their level of particular observance, or what denomination or stream or movement they identify with. There's major difference. I was on a conference Saturday night amongst Reform rabbis who were observing 50 years since their ordination. Some friends of mine, some whom I only knew by reputation and whatever. Some of them are wearing yarmulkes, some of them are not. Some of them have made aliyah to Israel. Some of them consider themselves agnostics or atheists. Some of the, so it does run the gamut. To the best of my knowledge, or the easiest thing that I can say in answer to your question, is that most scholars, now that doesn't necessarily mean most Jews, all right? But most scholars would say there's a philosophical or a theological tension, okay? That we believe that each of us has free will, okay? That we have free will to make our own decisions, our own choices. We believe that. But we also believe that there is a larger plan of some sort at work in the universe, that God does have a plan. And that's why you get into, okay, how can we describe, and sometimes we do classes or discussions or experiments or just group sessions of use that image that I was talking about before of, if God is the master puppeteer just pulling our strings, and we don't have any strength by which to change what we're doing? Or is God the author of the script, who wrote the script and is just standing back and watching as we act it out, because we can make whatever changes we want, because we do have free will, but God set everything in motion with a particular purpose? God's kind of holding his, crossing his fingers that it's going to work out the way that he saw, or sorry for saying he, that God saw, or God envisioned for the production to incur? Or is God the director saying to each of us as actors, this is where I want you to go, this is where I want you to stand, this is where I'm going to place you, but what you do once I've placed you there on stage is up to you?
Hadn't thought about it like that.
That's kind of, if I'm on the one hand, if I'm oversimplifying, and on the other hand, if I'm kind of summarizing. There certainly are rabbis that said, okay, God started the whole thing in motion, and then Shabbat v'nafash. God, this is all, God set it in motion, the prime mover in the Greek philosophy term, and is just letting us do what we choose to do. And every once in a while, as was exhibited in Genesis, every once in a while, God says, oh, whoops, they're not going in the right direction. I'm going to step in and change it around, or destroy it, and we'll start again. Now, that may not necessarily answer your question, but the story reflects this tension or this confusion of, do we really have free will? Does God know what we're going to decide to do, and is just kind of waiting for us? At which point will God intercede? The Torah says that God heard God started hearing the oppression at the beginning of the enslavement, when that first Pharaoh, the new Pharaoh, and God heard the cries of the Israelites, but God didn't respond at that point. It took 400 years. What happens, if you look carefully at the text, is that when at the time of Moses, it's God saw. And so the difference is, people, again, and this Reish Lakish, who must have been a teacher of some sort, he says, it's one thing to hear the confusion, hear the noise, hear the crying, whatever. It's something else to act as parents, for us to actually see, or as teachers, for us to actually see that our children or our students have come to understand what's going on. So that's how they say, God heard all these cries, but was waiting for the indication that they actually saw and understood. All right, Ricky, then
No,
Ricky.
I gotta go first. Ricky, I gotta go first.
Oh,
Because
okay.
I have another
Definitely.
commitment. Okay. I have
Gotcha.
Mahjong. So I'm gonna Mahjong comes first. And it started at 11
Priorities.
o'clock. So I'm gonna make Gary the host, and you guys can talk as long as you want. When it's all over, Gary knows how to shut it down.
Okay. Well, I only have till 11:30 anyway. Then I
That's
have to go.
okay. You can
Excuse
take.
me, I have to go
everybody can take
listen
a
to the president of the Hebrew Union College speak.
okay.
So, okay. So, all right. Ricky, please. Thanks, Ruth Ann.
Totally outside, because when you said that God came down or spoke or something, whenever they messed up, maybe there was a flood, maybe, whatever, to remind people what they're supposed to be doing, I immediately jumped back to reading of many years ago. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna exactly says that I will let you guys on your own, and when you mess up, I will come back, or I will send somebody down to, to straighten you guys out. So that concept is not just in Judaism, but it's in the Bhagavad Gita, and I'm sure it's in others that I haven't studied, that the Bodhisattva also, when he reaches nirvana, comes back just to straighten out the people, to get them back on the right course. So that to me indicates that we do have free will, but somebody's watching, and if we mess up too bad, somebody's going to come down and beat us over the head and say, hey, straighten up.
I was thinking as you were talking there, I was trying to remember in my mind, because I didn't make the note. One of the biblical commentators does a whole thing on really what is Pharaoh saying and thinking through this whole process, and what he, and I'm assuming that it was a he, what he does, meaning the commentator, not Pharaoh, what he does is with each of those 10 plagues, he gives a different interpretation of his heart being hardened. Okay, one is because of arrogance. One is because of a superiority complex. Another one is because he doesn't want to give up power. Another, and in each of those, he interprets the phrase. The Hebrew phrase is the same, but he interprets the phrase differently. And again, I invite you to make whatever parallels you want to present day leadership, but that he interprets the challenge to his own authority or narcissism, or whatever it be, by each of these different symbols or acts. Yes, Gail, you're muted, Gail.
The 9 circles of hell in Dante.
Yeah, right.
All the different levels. Yeah, okay.
It's something that's I've never heard discussed before is not only did Pharaoh harden his heart against the Jews, the Hebrews, but against his own people.
Exactly.
And to me, that tells me more about the character of Pharaoh than anything else. And that's never mentioned, but he's making his own people suffer out of his own stubbornness.
Right, and that's why Abravanel says that the plagues were meant not only to teach Pharaoh, but more importantly to teach the Egyptians that see, there is a God. A real God would care for the people. A real God would care about the livestock. A real God would care about things like that, rather than this man here who claims to be a God.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. And now, we will get to it in weeks to come, but I'll just throw it out for the moment that according to rabbinic literature, not according to the text, but according to rabbinic literature, the Pharaoh ultimately, after the 10th plague, and when he sends his army out to catch up with the Israelites at the shores of the sea, he doesn't go into the water. He stands like on the cliff and watches his soldiers and the horses and the chariots all being drowned in the water, and that's his ultimate punishment and whatever. And he relents, he repents, and according to rabbinic tradition, he leaves. Leave contemporary parallels out. He leaves his capital, he leaves the palace, and whether he's fleeing or whether he goes on his own out of embarrassment, but he goes to Nineveh, and he works himself up to become the leader of Nineveh. And when Jonah ultimately goes to preach at Nineveh, Pharaoh is the same Pharaoh who tells the people, listen, I've seen what this God can do. We better repent. We better change our ways. Okay. Someone's at my door and Lynn's not home. I'm going to have to go answer the doorbell. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
We will we'll follow up and wish you well, and hope to see you soon. Thanks especially to Gary and David.
Bye-bye.
Right.
Bye-bye. Take care and stay well.